the duo Daryl Hall and John Oates, or as many know them, Out of Touch, You Make My Dreams, I Can't Go For That, Man Eater, and Adult Education. John was inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 2004, and then inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2014. How are you doing today?
Pretty well, thanks. I've been doing a lot of Zooms today. We had a huge thunderstorm, and so kind of catching up on my internet responsibilities.
Oh, very nice. So, John, thank you again for coming on the podcast. I'd like to start off the episode by asking you, as a legend in music history yourself, what was it that first inspired you to become a musician?
Well, I had musical talent from the time I was a little kid. My parents recognized it, and they always supported me. So, I began taking singing lessons at 5 and guitar lessons at 6. So I've been playing for a long time. And actually, and I say this a lot, but I'm actually old enough to remember music before rock and roll because my parents were from the World War II generation. So they listened to big band music, swing, which was the music of their youth. And of course, as a little kid, that's the music that was playing in the house. And that's the music I heard. And of course, when rock and roll began in the early 50s, I was just old enough to realize that something new had happened, that there was this new, thing that was going on called rock and roll. It seems kind of crazy to talk about it that way, but it's the truth. So, in a sense, my musical life has paralleled the arc of the development of rock and roll.
So, for you as a young kid, what was it like for you when rock first came along? Was it like an immediate revelation, or did it take a little bit to process all of that?
No, no, it was definitely a revelation to me. I was only so say let's talk about the early 50s because that's when it kind of started. There was a radio station in Philadelphia where I grew up out in a little town outside of Philadelphia. There was a radio station that made a big deal out of the fact that they were going to play rock and roll music. That was like they made this big announcement. They were going to their entire format was going to be from rock and roll. And so I remember my next door neighbor was a teenager, and he had a car. He used to wash his car in the driveway, and while he was washing his car, he'd have the radio on. And I used to hear, the songs that were being played on this new radio station. And it was Chuck Berry and Fats Domino and Elvis and the Everly Brothers and Buddy Holly and the early architects of rock and roll, Little Richard. And so that was the music I heard first. And I was like, yeah, this is great. And being a young kid, just learning to play the guitar, of course, I wanted to like learn those songs. And so I tried. Of course, I was really young, but I did. And luckily, those early rock songs are pretty simple.
Yeah,
So that was always a positive.
that is awesome. And so, what was it like when the Beatles came along? Did they convey that same spirit of rock and roll that you were hearing, or did they seem a little different to you?
They were very different. You're probably not going to like to hear what I'm going to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. Um,
Okay.
I think you're talking about 64 or 65. I can't remember when the Beatles' first single came out. You would know in America.
Yeah, they came in
Yeah.
64.
Well, by that time, I was in 10th grade, you know. I was already playing in bands. I was doing horn arrangements. I was much more of a mature musician at that point. And when I first heard the Beatles, I didn't get it. I thought they sound like a garage band. They sound like a bunch of kids playing in a garage. I was already playing really sophisticated, much more sophisticated music with different types of chord changes and stuff like that. Much, and I was like, I don't, what's the fuss about these guys? They just sound like they're banging on their guitars. Little did I know, of course, that was a very ignorant and naive take on it. But now that in retrospect, they were basically listening to the same music I was listening to. They were a little bit older than me, but not much. So they were listening to Chuck Berry and Little Richard and the Everly Brothers, when they were growing up. So they were doing their interpretation, their British interpretation of that music. I mean, I want to hold your hand, a little bit like, in a sense, it's kind of like Paul McCartney trying to do Little Richard, you know what I mean? So I didn't really appreciate it as much. And here's a really interesting fact that I think a lot of people don't know about. In Philadelphia, the thing about Philadelphia was all about teenage dancing, and American Bandstand was a big deal in Philadelphia. In fact, American Bandstand kind of set the standard for how teenagers dressed, how they danced, because it went across the whole country. So, but the kids who were dancing on the American Bandstand were the kids who lived in Philadelphia, right near the television station. So that's how they. In fact, as crazy as this sounds, I'm going to get to a Beatles reference eventually.
Yeah.
The kids who were on American Bandstand were the kids whose high school was the closest to the TV station. So that as soon as school went out, they ran to the TV station, got in line, and they got on TV. So every week or every day when you saw American Bandstand, they were the same kids. And so those kids, the way they dressed, the way they danced, was like what other teenagers around America saw and what they thought, because there was no internet, there was no standard for, teenagers like in Iowa or Minnesota or South Dakota, they didn't know anything. So they saw the kids in Philadelphia. So when the Beatles came out, it wasn't really music you could dance to. Those songs were not very danceable at first. And so there was this weird, weird reaction in Philadelphia where some radio stations actually said they wouldn't play the Beatles because you can't dance to it.
Wow.
I know it seems insane, it's stupid, but seriously, Philadelphia was Philadelphia. Well, if you know anything, where do you live?
I live in New York.
Okay, well, Philadelphia is the biggest small town in the world. So, I mean, just so you know, people from Philadelphia don't even think about going to New York. It's only an hour and a half down the turnpike. But it's
Yeah.
Philadelphia's Philadelphia. They live in their own, little bubble. But seriously, they really had this giant anti-Beatle reaction, and that didn't last very long, of course. And as the Beatles evolved quickly, and as soon as they started doing stuff like Norwegian Wood and things like that, I began to listen in a different way. I began, oh, wait a minute, these guys are really doing something here. This is a whole different approach. And of course, then when the thing that really changed me for the Beatles was Abbey Road. When I heard how adventurous and how complicated and how cutting edge their record production was, because I was already making records at the same time. I made my first record in 1966. So when I heard Abbey Road, I thought, oh, well, there's a whole new level of record production that they were doing with George Martin and at the Abbey Road studios. And, the experimental stuff they were doing with tape machines and all the really unique techniques that they were developing that no one had ever done before. And that's when I really started paying attention. And I said, wow, these guys are on a whole other level. And so, and then from then on, I had a completely different perspective and a different appreciation for what they did.
Wow. So would you say that like the Beatles production on those records like Abbey Road inspired you and Daryl Hall while you guys were trying to find your sound?
Not really. No, we were coming from a completely different place. We were coming from more of an R&B kind of place. The thing of those, in terms of record production, yes, we realized that they had set a bar that was very, very high in terms of what you could do in a recording studio. And that was influential without a doubt. Just like the Beatles will freely admit that, they heard Pet Sounds that Brian Wilson was doing in the Beach Boys, and that kind of inspired them for Sergeant Pepper. They felt they wanted to do something more adventurous musically. And they did their own, and even the Rolling Stones will say the same thing. They heard Sergeant Pepper and they wanted to do, Their Majesties.
Their Majesty's request.
So, but that's how music works. That's how creative people do. They hear something that inspires them, or something clicks, and they go, "Wow, this is amazing. I want to do my version of this, or this is what's going on in the world." It's an organic creative process that people feed off of one another. But yeah, I mean, the Beatles set a standard that every record producer, every person that walked into the studio after Sergeant Pepper and Abbey Road, people were saying, well, these guys have they put the bar way up here. And now, we have to do we have to try to, reach that. Very few do, but of course, but
You mentioned creative processes, and I'd really like to ask you about yours. When your career first started to skyrocket, what was it like then from that moment on, trying to balance authenticity with experimentation in that creative process during those first moments?
well, Hall Oates had a very different, career trajectory. We were fortunate enough to sign with a label in the early '70s that actually believed in us in terms of longevity, and believed that we could be artists who could develop and evolve. Um, the concept of a one-hit wonder was not really part of the deal back in those days. If you got a record deal, you got a record deal based on the fact that the record company actually believed you had something to offer and that you might be able to have a long career. They looked at the long term. So we were very fortunate in that, because we did 3 albums before we had any success. Um, we had a little bit of success with She's Gone on the second album, but it really wasn't a hit. And then it wasn't until our fourth album, in 1970, late 74, 75, where we had a hit with Sarah Smile. And then, of course, we had Rich Girl, and then She's Gone was re-released, and that became a hit. So it took us 4 or 5 years before we even had our first hit. And then throughout the '70s, it was really the whole decade of the '70s was trying to create a sound, trying to develop a band, trying to develop a live show, trying to get better at what we did, trying to spread the word, tour around the world. And that lasted really for 10 years. And then it wasn't until the 1980s when we decided to produce ourselves. We had been using other producers prior to that. We decided to produce ourselves, and we decided that we needed a band that we could play live with, but also take into the studio. And that was the '80s band. And then and then of course we wrote some pretty decent songs. So those songs and that '80s band and producing ourselves, getting it just the way we wanted, that was what happened in the '80s. And that's when we had the mega success.
And looking back now, do you have a favorite song that you've written? One that brings back really fond memories when you listen to it or perform it?
There's a bunch. We're pretty lucky. She's Gone, the early song, because that's the song that kind of put us on the map. And I always think I call that song, it's a creative perfect storm. We wrote a great song. We were in the classic Atlantic recording studios with one of the best producers in the world, Arif Mardin, who surrounded us with the greatest studio musicians in New York at the time. And he wrote an incredible string arrangement. The production was pristine. So it was just one of those things where everything came together: the song, the players, the studio, the personnel. So that song really just always to me, and I play it every night. Whether it's a Hall and Oates show or I play solo show, I always play that song, and it's like a song that sounds like it was written yesterday. Yeah.
I have to tell you, Abandoned Luncheonette is in my top 10 albums of all time. Like every single song on there is
Well,
so good.
thank you. I agree. My favorite album too.
But you're right. I mean, these songs still sound so contemporary. It's like it's insane. What's the secret to making timeless music?
If I could bottle it, I would sell it. Trust me. You can't. There's no telling, how it happens. I think, initially when a song connects with people, when you have a hit, so to speak, it's because there's something about that music or that song, whether it be the lyrics, the melody, the vibe, the groove, the sensibility, seems to connect with the moment. connect with how people are thinking at that moment, how people are feeling at that moment, what's going on in the world at that moment. When all those things come together, that's what makes a hit. Because Lord knows there's been a lot of amazing songs that never really became hits. So yeah, it's an indefinable quality that really I don't think you can really describe.
Mm. Now, in the 1970s, you became very good friends with George Harrison. Can you tell me about that? What was it like to be friends with George?
Yeah. I met I'm a motor racing fan, and I always have been involved in race cars and things like that ever since I've been a kid. Through some mutual friends, I started driving race cars in the 70s, and I met through a friend in England, and through him, I met the Stewart family, Sir Jackie Stewart. Of course, he wasn't Sir then, but and his family. And then George was a really good. George was a very good friend of Jackie Stewart as well. And at the Long Beach Grand Prix in LA, when I was out there, I went to the race and hung out with George. That's where I met him for the first time. And you probably know that George has a song called Faster
Oh,
that
yeah.
he actually wrote about Jackie Stewart. There's a picture of me and George. I have the picture. I could send it to you if you want. It's a picture of George and I on the track at the Long Beach Grand Prix. And if you look very closely, George has this little miniature tape recorder and he's holding this little mic as the cars went by. And that's the sound that you hear in the beginning of the song Faster.
Wow.
And I was standing with George when he was recording all that. And he told me he had this idea for a song and he wanted to get the sound of the cars. So I'll send you the picture. It's a cool picture. Yeah, and then so we bonded really over the car thing, and then he invited me to his house at Friar Park in England, and that was an amazing experience just to see that incredible, weird, eclectic house that he had. And it was funny. We didn't really do any music. He wanted to show me the garden. He was really proud of the garden. I don't know if you know about it, but
Oh,
his
yeah, yeah.
his garden. Yeah, you're a real Beatle fanatic. Okay, yeah, his garden had all these like miniature Matterhorn and miniature Grotto Azzurra, Blue Grotto from Italy, and it were all these like it was just over the top fabulous, and so that was cool. And then when we were back in LA, George was there, and I asked him if he wanted to play on our album, which was an album we did called Along the Red Ledge, and we had some really great people guests on that album. And George said, "Yeah, yeah, I want to do it." And he said, I just want to be in the band." He goes, "I don't want any special treatment. I just want to be in the band." So okay, yeah, great. So he came and he played acoustic guitar. He didn't do anything special. He didn't want to. I didn't want to push him, and say, "Oh, come on, man, you got to do." He just wanted to play and be in the band, which was really cool. And that's how he was. He was very down to earth. He was very, he's quiet but funny, and just a great person. And then we had a really fun time. He invited Daryl and I over to his house to preview the Ruddles movie that he produced, and it was really funny because throughout the whole movie he kept talking about, he would point out all these little subtle little things and, oh yeah, look, that's what they're doing. They're trying to, they're goofing on me and John when we did this and that, so which is really cool. Yeah, and he was a really amazing person, and yeah, very very tragic loss.
John, when you look back on legacies such as your own and the Beatles, what do you think allows bands like the Beatles and Hall Oates to stand out in history when they're compared to every other band?
I think it's the songs. It's all about the songs. There's a million great singers. I mean, look, turn on America's Got Talent or The Voice or whatever. There's a million great singers. They're so good, but do they have a song to sing? Really? Without a song to sing, there's a million great guitar players, there's a million great drummers and bass players and blah 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 bands. It's all about the songs, and that's what sets groups and artists apart from the others. If their songs, can resonate and can stand the test of time.
Yep. Oh, I absolutely agree with you. And I'm just curious, do you happen to have a favorite Beatles song or record?
I like I said, I mean, I have huge appreciation for what they did with Sergeant Pepper and Abbey Road, but I like Norwegian Wood. There's something about that record that's really unique. It's got the sound of it. It's almost folky in a way. It's kind of It was like, to me, it was like they were dipping their toes in the future and where they could go. They weren't quite there yet, but they were like, oh, wait a minute, we can do something. It's not we don't have to do I want to hold your hand anymore. We're going to do something else, and that's what I like about it.
Mm. And how do you see the state of music now? Are you happy where popular music is today?
Well, I think there's a lot of great pop songs being made. There's, without a doubt. I'm very much into roots music, the Americana music scene. It's kind of my niche. I like blues and real R&B roots music, and folky stuff. And that's kind of what I do on my own, solo wise. I just want it to be real. I like organic playing. I like real playing with real players in the studio. I use a little bit of the modern technology when necessary, but I like the feeling of great players sitting in a circle looking at each other and playing.
And speaking of new music, I believe that you have some new music coming out. Can you tell us a little bit about that and if you're working on any current projects?
Yeah, I started last November with a series of digital singles that I released once a month, starting in November, and I'm on the sixth one now. The latest one is called "Too Late to Break Your Fall," which actually comes out this week. But last month I put out a reggae version of Maneater, which I recorded in Kingston, Jamaica, with the legends of reggae, the guys who played with Bob Marley, Toots and the Maytals, and Peter Tosh, people like that. I have a Jamaican friend who's a producer, and he organized the recording session in Kingston. And I went down there. And when I got the original idea for Maneater, before Daryl and I collaborated on it, my original idea was that it was a reggae song. So over the years, I've always wanted to take it back. So I did a reggae version of Maneater, which I did. And there's a really cool mini documentary on the making of that on YouTube now. But I've done a bunch of new originals. One called Disconnected, one called Pushing a Rock. I did an anti-war song called "Why Can't We Live Together," which was a cover of Timmy Thomas's song that he recorded in '71. So yeah, and I'm probably just going to keep releasing digital singles, and I'm playing live a lot, doing a lot of solo acoustic shows.
So exciting. And John, I'm going to leave all of the links to those projects that you were talking about in the podcast description so anyone listening can go click on
Great.
those at any moment. And John, if people want to know more about these projects or if they want to stay up to date with your releases or announcements, where can they find you at?
JohnOates.com. I'm on Instagram, John Oates Official. And I'm always doing weird stuff like driving around in old cars and riding my bike, and so all kinds of lifestyle stuff, and covering a lot of the solo shows. I'm doing a series of acoustic shows called An Evening of Songs and Stories, and I go out there with an acoustic guitar, and I have a friend who's a percussionist who plays with me, and we're doing some really cool shows around. We're not coming to New York, right? Playing in Connecticut, doing the Newport Folk Festival in July. So there's a bunch of cool stuff happening.
Awesome. I can't wait. And again, all of the